The emergency room doors didn't open. They exploded. Two armed military police officers moved through the entrance of Pine Valley Medical Center like they owned every inch of the floor, boots striking tile in hard, even rhythm. Behind them, a third officer in full dress uniform swept the room with the kind of eyes that had seen worse than a busy Oregon ER on a Wednesday night. Outside, a helicopter thundered low over the building. The lobby lights flickered once. 30 seconds earlier, a physician named Marcus Hale had pressed a laminated badge into the palm of a 31-year-old nurse and told her she was finished. She hadn't argued. She hadn't cried. She'd simply closed her fingers around the badge, set it on the counter, and walked toward the exit with her bag over one shoulder and her eyes straight ahead. Then the colonel stopped in the center of the lobby and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I need to know where Nurse Olivia Bennett is, right now." The room went quiet. Hale turned around slowly, and the look on his face, that was the beginning of everything unraveling. If this story already has your pulse up, hit follow, drop a like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this goes. Let's get into it. The night had been manageable until around 9:15, which was the point when manageable stopped being the right word for anything happening inside Pine Valley Medical Center's emergency department. Ashford, Oregon wasn't a large city. It sat in the lower Cascades with a population just under 90,000, the kind of place where the regional hospital was both the largest employer and the place everyone ended up, eventually, one way or another. Pine Valley Medical Center had 412 beds, a trauma bay that handled everything from logging accidents to the occasional highway pileup on Route 18, and a rotating staff of physicians, nurses, and support personnel who mostly knew each other well enough to be either close or quietly resentful, depending on the shift. Olivia Bennett had worked the ER floor for 3 years. Before that, she'd spent 2 years doing per diem trauma work in Portland while she sorted herself out after leaving a life she didn't talk about. She was 31, dark-haired, and built like someone who had learned early that the world would not slow down for her, so she might as well stop asking it to. She wasn't warm in the way people meant when they said a nurse was warm. She didn't squeeze hands and murmur reassurances. What she did was work. She moved fast, she read a room accurately, and she caught things that other people missed. That last quality was the one that had been causing problems lately. At 9:17, a man named Gerald Foss was in Bay 4 having a cardiac event. He was 62, hypertensive, currently conscious but deteriorating, and he'd come in complaining of pressure in his chest that he'd been ignoring for 2 days because, as he told Olivia while she was running his EKG, he'd assumed it was indigestion. "It is not indigestion," she said, not unkindly. "Yeah, I figured that out around hour 48. She almost smiled. She was looking at his chart when Dr. Marcus Hale appeared at the bay entrance, already talking. Hale was the senior attending on duty that night, 44 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a manner that suggested he found most rooms insufficiently impressed by him. He was not a bad physician. He was, however, the kind of physician who had been told he was exceptional for long enough that he'd stop checking his own assumptions. "Foss, right? I'll take it from here." He reached for the chart. Olivia didn't move. "He needs a repeat troponin before we adjust the protocol. The first draw was 47 minutes ago, and his symptoms are, I can read a chart." "I know. I'm saying the timing matters. If we push metoprolol before the second draw and the troponin has climbed, we're going to—" "Bennett," he said her name the way some people said stop. "I appreciate your input. Go check on 11. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Foss was watching them both with the anxious attention of a man who understood that the people arguing over his chart were arguing over him. "Dr. Hale," she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry past the bay. "His pressure's been dropping for the last 8 minutes. If you're going to order metoprolol, I need you to look at that trend first." "I've ordered it." She pulled up the vitals on the wall monitor. "Here, 8 minutes." He glanced at it. His jaw moved slightly. Something crossed his face. She couldn't tell if it was recognition or irritation. And then he looked away from the screen and back at her. "I'll monitor it. Go check on 11. She went. But she stopped at the nurse's station first and flagged Priya Anand, the charge nurse on duty, a 28-year-old with quick eyes and the particular professional instinct that developed in people who paid attention. Keep an eye on 4, Olivia said, low. And on what gets ordered? Priya looked at her. You want me to flag it? I want you to know about it. Priya nodded once and went back to her monitor. Olivia moved down the hall to Bay 11. 12 minutes later, Gerald Foss's blood pressure dropped sharply. The second troponin draw came back significantly elevated. Hale adjusted the order without acknowledging that the adjustment had been necessary, and the patient stabilized. The correct treatment happened. Nobody discussed how. Olivia knew because Priya texted her 2 words from across the department. You were right, she already knew that. The knowing hadn't required confirmation. What came next took longer to materialize, but it had been building since before that shift. Before that week, probably. Hale had a long memory and a short tolerance for being corrected, and Olivia had corrected him in one form or another more times than was comfortable for either of them. She was not doing it to be difficult. She genuinely could not watch an error move forward unchecked and say nothing. She had been in situations where saying nothing cost too much, and that education had permanently rewired something in her. At 11:40, he found her in the break room. She was standing at the counter, drinking coffee that had gone cold, going over a patient's discharge notes on a tablet when he came in and closed the door. That was the first sign. People didn't close the break room door unless they wanted the conversation private. We need to talk about tonight, he said. Okay? You undermined me in front of a patient. She looked up from the tablet. I raised a concern about a medication order, quietly. The patient didn't hear it. He heard the tone. I don't know what to tell you. The concern was valid. The concern, Hale said, was you overstepping. Again. This is the 3rd time in 6 weeks you've second-guessed an attending's order in a patient area. In 2 of those cases, the order was wrong. That's not the... He stopped, regrouped. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled in the way that meant he'd decided to be careful. That's not the point. The point is that there's a process. If you have a concern, you raise it through the appropriate channel. You don't call it out in the bay. The appropriate channel takes time. If something's about to go wrong, I'm going to say something. Then maybe, he said, this isn't the right environment for you. She put the tablet down, looked at him. Is that what we're doing? He met her eyes. He didn't look away. I'm going to talk to Nora in the morning. Nora Voss was the hospital's director of clinical operations. She was 51, efficient, and deeply committed to institutional stability, which was another way of saying she did not like friction, and she especially did not like friction that involved her highest revenue physicians. Marcus Hale brought in 2 federal research grants and a clinical trial partnership with a pharmaceutical company in Seattle. He was, in the cold arithmetic of hospital administration, worth considerably more than Olivia Bennett. She knew all of this. She still didn't say she was sorry for what she'd done. All right, she said. He left. She stood in the break room for another minute, drank the cold coffee, and then went back to work because there were still 4 hours left on her shift, and the patients didn't care about any of this. The meeting with Nora Voss happened 2 days later, on a Friday morning, in a conference room on the administrative floor that had a view of the parking structure and a table long enough to make every small conversation feel like a formal proceeding. Olivia arrived on time. Hale was already there, seated to Voss's right, his expression neutral in the practiced way of someone who had won this type of meeting before. There was an HR representative present, a man named Bart Elgin, who had the look of someone who had witnessed a great many difficult conversations and had learned to flatten his affect entirely. Voss opened the folder in front of her. Olivia, thank you for coming in. Of course. We've had some concerns raised about your conduct on Wednesday night, and more broadly, about a pattern of behavior over the past several weeks. She said pattern of behavior the way administrators always did, like the phrase was a technical term, precise and clinical, rather than a construction designed to make one incident sound like many. I'd like to see the documentation, Olivia said. Voss looked up briefly. We're in the process of... Before this meeting, I requested the incident reports and any formal complaints filed against me. I was told they'd be available today. We're still compiling. I have the right to see what I'm responding to. That's not a complicated request. Elgin wrote something down. Hale's neutral expression didn't change, but something around his eyes tightened. Olivia, Voss said, with the careful patience of someone managing a situation they'd already internally resolved. The concern isn't documentation. The concern is your working relationship with the medical staff. Specifically, a pattern of, I caught a medication error on Wednesday. The patient's troponin was trending up, and Dr. Hale had ordered a beta blocker that would have complicated the picture significantly. I raised it quietly. The patient stabilized after the order was adjusted. Dr. Hale felt undermined. I understand that. That's a problem for the department. She looked at Voss directly. What's the process for flagging a safety concern when the attending isn't responding to it at the bedside? Voss paused. There's an escalation process through charge nursing. I flagged Priya Anand. That's the escalation. I also spoke to Dr. Hale directly, quietly, before any order was executed. The patient didn't hear it. This isn't about one incident. No, Olivia said. It's about 3 incidents in 6 weeks. In 2 of them, I was right about the clinical concern. In the 3rd, I raised a question that was answered within 2 minutes and turned out to be irrelevant. That's my pattern. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Voss folded her hands and said, We're placing you on administrative suspension pending a full review. We'll be in touch within 5 business days. Olivia picked up her bag. She didn't look at Hale. I'd like that documentation when it's ready. She left the building through the side entrance and walked to her car in the staff lot. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at the steering wheel for a while. Not crying, just processing the specific familiar sensation of being technically right and institutionally irrelevant, which was a feeling she had more experience with than she would have chosen. She drove home. She made soup. She went to bed at a reasonable hour because she had learned a long time ago that falling apart rarely improved a situation. The call came on Monday morning. She was back in Voss's office, and this time there was a second HR representative present, a woman Olivia hadn't seen before, with a termination packet already printed and waiting on the table. The investigation had taken 3 business days. The documentation she'd requested still hadn't been provided. After a thorough review, Voss said, reading from the packet with the flat affect of someone delivering pre-decided news, Pine Valley Medical Center has determined that continued employment is not in the best interest of the department or the institution. We're terminating your employment, effective today, with 2 weeks severance and the option to... What specifically did the review find? Voss looked up. The review took 3 days, Olivia said. I'd like to know what specifically it found that constitutes cause for termination. The report cites an ongoing pattern of, I want the specific incident cited, with dates. Elgin cleared his throat. Olivia, this process is... I'm not signing anything without seeing what I'm being terminated for. That's not obstruction. That's basic employment law. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Voss said, You'll receive the full documentation within 48 hours. Today, we need your badge. Olivia removed it from her lanyard. She set it on the table, not hard enough to be dramatic, not gently enough to suggest she was fine with any of this. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. She made it all the way through the lobby, which was full of the mid-morning bustle of a hospital in operation. Patients checking in, families waiting, orderlies crossing with equipment. And nobody stopped her, and nobody looked at her for long. She was just a woman walking out of a building with a bag on her shoulder. Except Priya was at the triage desk and saw her go. And the way Priya's face looked, the particular quality of helplessness in it, was the one thing Olivia had not prepared for. She pushed through the main doors and didn't look back. The parking lot was half full and windy. She sat in her car and didn't start the engine. She'd parked in the same spot she always used, out of habit, which now felt faintly absurd. The hospital rose above the lot, 4 stories of glass and concrete, the word medical visible in steel letters over the main entrance. She'd worked there for 3 years. She knew the layout the way she knew the back of her hand, every supply closet, every shortcut between departments, which elevator was fastest at which time of day, which attending had the messiest handwriting, which residents were learning fast, and which ones were coasting. None of that mattered to the institution. She pulled out her phone. She thought about calling her sister in Sacramento and decided against it. She thought about calling a former colleague in Portland and decided against that too. She didn't have anything useful to say yet, and she wasn't in the habit of talking before she had something to say. She started the engine. She drove 2 miles south, stopped at a gas station to get a bottle of water, and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the radio off. The October sky was gray over the mountains. She could smell rain coming. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number, Oregon area code she didn't recognize. She stared at it for 2 rings. On a normal day, she didn't answer unknown numbers. On a normal day, she still had a job. She picked up. "Bennett," she said, by force of habit, the way she'd answered her phone for years. A pause on the other end. Then a voice. Female, clipped, the specific cadence of someone who gave orders professionally and expected them to be followed. "Is this Olivia Bennett?" Previously attached to... A pause, like the speaker was choosing her words. "Previously attached to Forward Surgical Unit Delta, Task Force 17, out of Joint Base Lewis McChord?" The gas station noise fell away. The October wind. All of it. "Who is this?" Olivia said. "Colonel Diane Mercer, United States Army Medical Command. Ms. Bennett, I need you to come back to Pine Valley Medical Center. Now, not as a request." Olivia's hand tightened on the phone. "I was terminated this morning." "I know," Mercer said. "I was there. I need you back in that building in the next 20 minutes. There is a man on that trauma table who is going to die if you're not in that room, and the people who are currently in that room do not know how to stop it." The line held. Outside the gas station, a truck pulled past. A kid on a bicycle crossed the lot. The ordinary world continued indifferently. "Who's the patient?" Olivia said. A beat. Then, "Commander Ethan Rourke. He was extracted from a forward operating position 14 hours ago. The injury pattern is..." "I know who Rourke is." Silence on both ends. 20 minutes, Mercer said. Olivia was already putting the car in reverse. She didn't use the highway. The surface road back to Pine Valley Medical Center was 2 minutes longer but had fewer lights, and Olivia took it without deciding to, the way the body sometimes makes the efficient choice before the mind catches up. Her hands were steady on the wheel. She noticed that and filed it away. The way she'd learned to pay attention to her own physical state, the way she paid attention to a patient's. Because the moment you stopped monitoring was usually the moment something went wrong. Rourke. She ran the name through what she knew and didn't let herself run it through what she felt, because feeling it wasn't useful right now. Commander Ethan Rourke. 43, she estimated, probably 44 by now. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been standing outside a field hospital in a place she was not going to think about at 60 miles an hour on a wet road in Oregon. He'd been unhurt then. He'd been the one checking on her. She pushed that aside. 14 hours out of a forward operating position, Mercer had said. Blast pattern injuries. Which meant the damage wasn't from a single event. It was layered, sequenced, the body sustaining multiple insults across a short window, and the trauma presenting as one thing when it was several. The teams inside didn't know what they were looking at. She did. She had worked that pattern in conditions where the nearest surgical suite was a tent, and the nearest sterile instrument was whatever she could clean fast enough. She pulled into the Pine Valley lot, parked badly across 2 spaces because there wasn't time to care, and walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors opened. The lobby air hit her. That specific hospital smell, antiseptic and recycled and faintly sweet in a way that no ventilation system ever fully eliminated. The woman at the reception desk looked up. Recognition moved across her face, followed by something uncertain. Olivia had been here this morning, with a bag, and now she was back without the bag, and the hospital's political weather had clearly shifted in some way the front desk staff hadn't been briefed on yet. Olivia moved past her. Hale was at the trauma bay entrance. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her 1 second to decide what to do with her face, and she decided on nothing. No expression she'd have to maintain under pressure. He turned as she came down the hall and went very still. "You don't work here," he said. "I know." She kept moving. He stepped into her path. Not touching her, just occupying the space. "Bennett, you cannot be in this department." "I was asked to be here by United States Army Medical Command." She held his gaze. "You can call your legal team or you can move. Both options exist." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not anger, exactly. More like the specific discomfort of a man realizing he wasn't holding the cards he thought he was holding. He stepped aside. Not graciously, but he stepped. She pushed through the bay doors. The trauma room was crowded. 2 attendings, 3 nurses, a respiratory tech, and 2 military personnel standing near the door with the particular stillness of people trained to observe without interfering until interference became necessary. Mercer was at the head of the room, arms crossed, watching the monitor with an expression that said the numbers were not what she wanted them to be. Rourke was on the table. She let herself look at him for exactly 1 second, at the damage, at the monitors, at the IV lines, and the oxygen and the wound sites, and then she moved. "What's his pressure?" she said to the nearest nurse, not loudly. The nurse, a man she recognized vaguely, one of the overnight regulars, looked at her with the reflexive uncertainty of someone unsure whether to answer. 84/50 and dropping, he said, because the patient's deteriorating condition apparently outweighed the question of her authority. When did it start dropping? 12 minutes ago. It was 91 when he came in. She looked at the primary wound site, left lateral thorax, handled, packed. Looked at the secondary site on the right abdomen, handled, dressed. Looked at the monitor. Looked back at the abdomen. Has anyone assessed for splenic involvement? The attending nearest her, a man named Garfield, whose name she pulled from 3 years of peripheral awareness, looked up from the chart. Primary injury is thoracic. We've been managing. The pressure's been dropping for 12 minutes, and it started after you stabilized the thoracic bleed. She moved to the side of the table. That means something else is moving. Blast injuries like this one. The splenic capsule can hold for hours after the initial event and then let go. Has he had an abdominal ultrasound? Garfield's jaw tightened. We did a fast exam on intake. How long ago? A pause. 40 minutes? His pressure has been moving in the wrong direction for 12. I need a repeat fast right now. You're not on staff here, Garfield said, not combatively, more like someone who was genuinely trying to establish the rules of the situation. Mercer spoke from the back of the room. She's operating under military medical consultation authority. Do the ultrasound. Garfield looked at Mercer, looked at the monitor, looked at Rourke. He did the ultrasound. The image came up on the screen. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Garfield said something low and unprintable because the free fluid in the left upper quadrant was visible and unmistakable, and it had not been there 40 minutes ago. He's bleeding, the nurse said. He's been bleeding, Olivia said, not unkindly. Get surgery on the phone. He needs an OR now, not in 10 minutes. She was already adjusting the IV flow. And get me 4 units of O negative ready. When that capsule goes fully, it'll go fast. The room moved. Not because of her exactly, because the image on the screen had given everyone permission to respond to what was actually happening instead of what they'd thought was happening. She'd seen that before too. People didn't resist information usually. They resisted the disruption of being wrong. Show them the image and most of the resistance dissolved. Hale appeared at the bay door. He stood there watching. She didn't look at him. Gishem. Rourke's pressure stabilized marginally. Enough. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to move him to the OR without losing him in transit, which was the immediate calculation. The surgical team took him up on the elevator at a controlled run, one of Mercer's officers moving with the gurney, the rest of the military personnel staying on the ER floor. Olivia peeled off her gloves at the sink and stood for a moment with her hands under the warm water. Her reflection in the metal panel above the sink was fragmentary, distorted. She looked like the suggestion of herself. Hale came in behind her. She heard him stop a few feet back. She didn't turn around. You can't practice medicine here without privileges, he said. Whatever authority that colonel is claiming, the hospital has to… Talk to legal, she said. Or talk to her. I'm not the right conversation. You were terminated this morning. I know, I was there. So explain to me how you're currently operating in my department. She turned off the water and reached for paper towels. Turned around. He looked like a man who had walked into a building and found the floor plan had been rearranged without his knowledge. Not quite angry, not quite lost, something in between. I don't work for you, she said. I didn't this morning and I don't now. If you have a problem with my presence in that bay, The person to talk to is Colonel Mercer. She has the authority and she'll explain what she can. What does the military want with this hospital? I genuinely don't know, she said. That was mostly true. She dropped the paper towels and walked past him. Mercer found her in the hallway outside the trauma bay, holding 2 cups of coffee that had appeared from somewhere. Olivia suspected one of the junior military officers had located the nearest machine with the focused competence that characterized every enlisted person she'd ever worked with. Here, Mercer said, holding one out. Olivia took it. The cup was warm. He's going to make it, Mercer said. It wasn't a question. He's going to make it through surgery. What happens after that depends on what's underneath the blast damage. I haven't seen his full records. You'll have them. They stood in the hallway for a moment. The hospital noise moved around them. Intercom pages, distant carts, the specific acoustic texture of a building in perpetual operation. You should have been harder to find, Mercer said. You found me in 20 minutes. We had your last known employment on file, the address, the car registration. A pause. We had more than that, actually. We've been aware of your location for a while. Olivia looked at her. That's a strange thing to say casually. It wasn't casual. Mercer looked down at her coffee. There's context I need to give you. Some of it I should have given you before I called, but there wasn't time. Give it to me now. Mercer turned slightly, orienting herself away from the traffic in the hall. Her voice dropped enough that it didn't carry. Rourke's unit was running a secondary operation when he was hit. Not the forward position they were officially assigned to. Something parallel, run through a different command chain. She paused. Part of what they were looking into involved this hospital. The hallway felt quieter suddenly, the way things got quiet when information rearranged the landscape. Pine Valley, Olivia said, specifically some of its billing records, and some of its internal incident documentation over the past year. Mercer met her eyes. I'm not in a position to give you details on an active investigation. What I can tell you is that Rourke requested you specifically when we identified this hospital as the location of his medical emergency. He knew you were here. He had a reason for that. What reason? He'll have to tell you himself, when he's out of surgery and conscious. A pause. If you're willing to stay. Olivia wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Outside the window at the end of the hall, the October sky had gone the color of old concrete. I was fired this morning, she said. I'm not sure I have a legal basis to be in this building. You're under military consultation authority. That's federal. The hospital doesn't have a mechanism to remove you while that's active. Mercer held her gaze. But that's also temporary, which is why timing matters. Olivia thought about the parking lot, the gas station, the phone buzzing on the seat. All of this had started from a call she almost didn't pick up, and she still didn't fully know where she'd landed. All right, she said. She drank the coffee. It was bad. The machine variety, thin and slightly burnt. And she didn't care. Bathtub. The hospital's administrative floor had a particular quality in the late afternoon. The volume dropped, the foot traffic thinned, and the decisions that had been building pressure all day began leaking through the walls as raised voices or rapid footsteps, or the sound of a door closing with more force than intended. Olivia had learned to read it the same way she read a patient floor, and she could tell from 2 hallways away that something was happening up there. What was happening was Nora Voss discovering that her termination of Olivia Bennett had been functionally overridden by a branch of the federal government, and that the documentation of this override had already been routed to the hospital's legal counsel, and that legal counsel had spent approximately 45 minutes determining that there was no clean path to disputing it. She didn't witness this directly. She learned the shape of it from Priya Anand, who had an exceptional talent for knowing what was happening in buildings she was nominally only occupying. Voss is in her office with legal right now, Priya said, low, during the 15 seconds they shared near the supply station on the ground floor. She'd come down on a pretense, a medication run that didn't require her personally, but that had brought her past the elevator bank at the right moment. Hale's been up there twice. Whatever they're saying to each other, the 2 of them together in a room feels like... She stopped. Like what? Priya looked at her. Like people comparing notes on something they're scared of. Olivia noted that. Are you okay? Me? Yes. I'm fine. I'm angry, actually, if you want to know. I'm very angry. Priya's voice was controlled, but there was something running underneath it. I saw what happened this morning, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. And then you came back this afternoon, and I still didn't say anything because I didn't understand what was happening. And now there are military officers walking around my department asking to see records, and I would very much like someone to explain the situation. I don't have the full picture, Olivia said, honestly. Do you have part of the picture? I'm getting there. Priya looked at her for a moment. Were you, before all this, before the hospital, were you... She seemed to be trying to phrase something carefully. There are people asking questions about you. The officers, they know you. I know them, Olivia said. Some of them. Okay. Priya processed this. Okay. Do I need to be worried? About what? About any of it. Olivia considered this honestly. Not about the people asking questions, she said. Priya heard what she didn't say and nodded once and went back upstairs. The military officers with the laptops and the sealed case had set up in a consultation room on the second floor that had been, until approximately 3 hours ago, used for family meetings and the occasional difficult diagnosis. They'd asked for it politely, and the charge nurse on that floor had given it to them, because when a United States Army colonel asks for a room in a tone that implies the absence of a reasonable objection, most people find their objections resolving. Olivia passed the room on her way to the scrub area, where she'd been told a set of surgical scrubs had been located for her. One of the officers had handled it with the same quiet efficiency that had produced the coffee earlier. She glanced through the narrow window in the consultation room door as she passed. 2 officers, 1 laptop each, a stack of folders, color-coded, and spread across half the table, a grid of printed documents that, from the brief angle she had, looked like medical records sorted by date. She kept walking. She changed into the scrubs in the locker room, standing in front of the row of metal doors that had been a feature of her daily life for 3 years, and that now felt slightly foreign, the way familiar spaces sometimes felt after the relationship with them changed. She put on the scrubs, rolled the sleeves twice, and sat down on the bench for a moment with her elbows on her knees. Her hands were faintly trembling, just faintly. The drop in adrenaline after Rourke had been stabilized, the body reclaiming the energy it had borrowed. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and waited it out. This was not new. The body did what it did, and you let it. The door opened. Mercer came in, which was a slight procedural irregularity given that this was a staff locker room. But Mercer did not appear to observe that kind of procedural irregularity. "Surgery's going well," she said. Olivia looked up. "You have someone in the OR." "I have someone outside the OR. They're keeping us informed." She crossed the room and sat down on the bench opposite, which put her about 4 feet away, knees angled toward Olivia. The posture was less formal than anything Olivia had seen from her yet. Not unprofessional, but more direct, like a conversation rather than a briefing. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." That was quick. "I'm functional. That's the relevant metric." Mercer almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but the intention was there. "You haven't changed much." "You didn't know me well enough to measure that." "I reviewed your file multiple times." A pause. "After you separated from the unit, Rourke filed a commendation report that took 7 pages. 7. I've seen 4-page after-action reports for entire operations. He wrote 7 pages about 1 medical officer." Olivia said nothing. "He was thorough," Mercer said. "He described the night of the Kandahar extraction in considerable detail, among other things." "That was a long time ago." "Yes." Mercer looked at her steadily. "Why did you leave?" The locker room was quiet. The fluorescent lights had the faint hum of every institutional lighting fixture in every hospital Olivia had ever worked in, and for a second it felt like all of them were the same room. "I needed to be somewhere where people weren't dying at the rate they were dying there," she said. "That's the most accurate way I can put it." Mercer nodded, not dismissively, with the acknowledgement of someone who understood that some answers were as complex as they were simple. "And then you ended up here," she said. "And then I ended up here, where someone decided to fire you. Mercer's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, sharper. The reason I want to give you context now, rather than waiting for Rourke, is that what I'm about to show you involves your time at this institution directly. You have a right to know what we found. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a folder, standard manila, sealed with a metal clasp. She held it out. Olivia took it. She opened it. The first page was her Pine Valley personnel file. She'd seen it before. She'd requested it twice in the past year, standard practice, a habit she'd maintained from a professional context where documentation was everything. The file she'd been given had been unremarkable. Performance reviews ranging from satisfactory to good. No formal complaints on record. A note about an incident from 14 months ago that had been listed as resolved. The file in this folder was different. Same header, same employee number, same start date. Different annotations, different incident reports, different entries in the margins and between the standard blocks, in a notation style she didn't recognize, time-stamped, coded, clearly not standard hospital formatting. She turned to the second page, the third. Her eyes moved fast. 8 months of incident reports she had never been informed of. Formal complaints filed under her name that had never been shared with her, which was a procedural violation significant enough that it would have flagged in any standard HR audit. Patient feedback forms, allegedly, noting concerns about her conduct. None of them matching anything in the record she'd been given. None of them matching any event she could map to her actual working history. She turned to the fourth page. The incident reports were formatted correctly. The language was institutional, specific, credible sounding. The dates were plausible, and they were entirely fabricated. Someone had been building this file for 8 months, not reacting to her, not responding to genuine concerns. Building. She looked up from the folder. Mercer was watching her. "We identified the access logs," she said quietly. "The records were created and modified from 2 terminals. One belongs to HR. One is registered to an administrative level account in clinical operations." A pause. "Both accounts have been accessed from a third device on several occasions, using shared credentials. We're still tracing that." Olivia looked back down at the folder. The pages felt ordinary in her hands. Paper, ink, standard font. And the ordinariness of them made the thing they contained more difficult to absorb, not less. "They were removing me," she said. "Yes. Before I found something. That's our working theory. What was I going to find?" Mercer's expression was careful. "That's where the investigation gets complicated. We believe it connects to what Rourke was running, but I don't have enough to give you a complete picture yet." "Then give me the incomplete one." Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then, "The billing irregularities we identified touch several departments, but the pattern concentrates in the ER and in surgical. Specifically, it involves medication administration records. What was ordered, what was actually administered, and what was documented as administered." She paused. "There are cases where those 3 things don't match, over a sustained period, in a pattern consistent with diversion. Drug diversion. The systematic theft of controlled medications from a hospital system, substituting saline or inferior compounds, and documenting the real drug as administered. It was not uncommon. It was not usually sophisticated. When it was sophisticated, when it persisted over months without being caught, it meant someone with access and knowledge and institutional cover. And it meant patients who had received, at some point, something other than what their charts said they'd received." Olivia set the folder on the bench beside her, pressed her palms flat on her thighs again. The slight tremor was gone now, replaced by something steadier and colder. "How long?" she said. "The earliest anomaly we've flagged is 14 months ago." 14 months. The note in her personnel file, the incident listed as resolved, the one that had made her look at her own record twice because she hadn't been able to match it to any actual event, was 14 months ago. She'd caught something 14 months ago. She hadn't known what she'd caught. Someone had known she'd caught something and had started building a paper trail to remove her. She'd lasted 14 months. "Who else knows?" she said. "Within the hospital, we don't believe anyone else has connected the pieces the way we have. There are individuals who know parts. Mercer's voice was even. There are individuals who are part of it. Olivia looked up. We don't have names yet, Mercer said. We have access logs, accounts, patterns. A pause. We will have names. Down the hall, distantly, Olivia heard the sound of footsteps moving fast. Not running, but close to it. And a door opening on a hinge that needed oiling. The sound of an administrative floor in motion. Voss, probably. Or Hale. Or both of them, comparing notes on something they were scared of. She picked up the folder. She closed it and held it on her knees and looked at the locker room door. I need to make a call, she said. There's one more thing, Mercer said. Olivia waited. Priya Anand, the charge nurse. One of my officers spoke with her approximately an hour ago, requesting access to 6 months of medication administration records. Mercer's voice was careful. She provided them. She also provided, voluntarily and without being asked, a set of notes she'd been keeping personally. In a notebook, not on the hospital system. A pause. Handwritten. She'd been tracking anomalies in the controlled substance logs for 4 months. She didn't know what she was looking at. She thought she was making a mistake, and she kept checking, and the numbers kept being wrong. The locker room was very quiet. 4 months, Olivia said. Yes. She was there this morning, when I was escorted out. Yes. Olivia stood up. She had the folder in one hand and the empty coffee cup, somehow still, in the other. She set the cup on the bench and looked at the door. Down the hall, the footsteps had stopped. There was a silence of the kind that came before a door opened or a phone rang, a held breath in the architecture of the building, the moment just before something moved. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of the scrubs. She pulled it out. Unknown number. Different area code this time. The kind of number that came from a federal line routed through a relay. She looked at the screen, then at Mercer. Is this yours? Mercer shook her head slowly. No. Olivia stared at the screen. The phone buzzed a second time. A third. The number didn't resolve into anything she recognized. She answered it. Static, briefly. The kind that meant encryption handshake, a line being established rather than noise. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, flat and professional, with the accent of someone trained to minimize regional identifiers. Ms. Bennett, this is Special Agent Arden Malloy, HHS Office of Inspector General. I need to inform you that as of 30 minutes ago, a federal preservation order has been issued for all medical and administrative records at Pine Valley Medical Center. A pause, measured. And I need to ask you directly, how much do you know about Dr. Marcus Hale's relationship with a pharmaceutical distribution company called Veritas Medical Supply? The locker room walls didn't move. The lights didn't change. Everything was exactly where it had been. She had never heard the name Veritas Medical Supply in her life, but Marcus Hale had been with this hospital for 9 years, and the billing irregularities went back 14 months, and she had caught something once and not known what it was. And someone had spent 8 months building a false record to remove her before she caught it again. She kept her voice level. I need about 10 minutes, she said. Then I can talk. She ended the call, looked at Mercer. You knew about the OIG, she said. It wasn't a question, and Mercer didn't treat it as one. We've been running parallel, Mercer said. Different triggers, same target. Rourke's investigation came in through procurement records, military contracts. The hospital has a supply arrangement with Veritas that routes through a defense contractor account. She paused. Rourke knew about the arrangement before he was hit. He also knew you were here. He told me 6 weeks ago that if anything happened and the operation brought them to Pine Valley, they should find you first. Another pause. He said, and I'm quoting, she'll have already seen it. She just won't know what she saw. Olivia stood very still. Outside the locker room, in the corridor, she heard a door open, heard Nora Voss's voice, sharp and clipped, asking a question to someone who wasn't answering it, and then under that, the sound of a printer running somewhere on the administrative floor, printing fast. A lot of pages. The kind of printing that happened when someone was trying to move documents before they were ordered not to. She moved before Mercer could say anything else. The locker room door swung open and she was in the corridor, the sealed folder still in her hand, the phone in the other, walking toward the administrative floor stairwell with the particular speed of someone who had made a decision and was already 3 steps into executing it. Mercer fell in beside her without being asked, not following exactly, more like 2 people who had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. "How long does it take to print a file?" Olivia said. "Depends on the file. A personnel file, with annotations, with 8 months of fabricated incident reports." Mercer was already on her radio, low and fast, 2 clipped words to whoever was on the other end. Olivia took the stairs, 2nd floor, then 3rd. The administrative wing occupied the northeast corner. She knew this the way she knew everything about the building's layout, from 3 years of navigating it and 1 year of quietly noticing things that didn't sit right. She heard the printer before she reached the hallway. It was running fast, the sound of sheets moving through rollers in rapid succession, the mechanical tempo of a machine doing what it was told without knowing why. She turned the corner. The administrative assistant's desk was empty. Whoever usually sat there had stepped away or been sent away. The door to Nora Voss's office was almost closed. Almost. A 2-inch gap, enough for the sound of voices to leak through. Hale's voice first. "Can't leave it on the server. They've got a preservation order." Then Voss. "The order covers electronic records. Paper is different." "Paper isn't different, Nora. Paper is discoverable." "Not if it's not here to be discovered." Olivia stopped outside the door. Mercer was 4 feet behind her, already on the phone with someone. The call from the OIG, Olivia realized. Malloy. Mercer was connecting them, moving pieces. She pushed the door open. Hale was standing at the printer tray, a stack of pages in his hand, thick enough to represent months of documentation. Voss was at her desk, a second stack already in a manila envelope, her hand on the clasp. They both looked up. The specific quality of their silence, how fast it arrived, how complete it was, told her everything about what they'd been doing and how long they'd been doing it. "Put those down," Olivia said. Hale's face cycled through several expressions in about 2 seconds. He landed on the one that had worked for him in the past: authority, professional distance, the look of a senior physician addressing a problem that had mistakenly walked into his space. "You are not authorized to be in this office. Those documents are subject to a federal preservation order issued 30 minutes ago." She held up the phone. "Special Agent Malloy from the HHS Office of Inspector General. You can speak to him directly, or you can put the papers down." Voss stood up. She was good at composure. Olivia had watched her maintain it through budget crises and 2 joint commission inspections, and 1 catastrophic plumbing failure that had shut down half the 2nd floor for a week. But composure and calm weren't the same thing, and right now Voss had the former without the latter. Her hands were doing something deliberate and controlled, and her face was doing something that cost effort. "Olivia," she said in the tone of someone trying to locate familiar ground, "I understand this situation feels—" "Malloy," Olivia said into the phone. "I'm in the office of Pine Valley's Director of Clinical Operations. 2 individuals are in possession of documents that may fall under your preservation order. I need guidance on immediate steps." The voice on the phone was calm and specific. She listened. She nodded once. She looked at Hale. "He wants you to not move," she said. Hale's hand tightened on the papers. She watched it happen, the knuckles shifting, the pages compressing slightly, the involuntary grip of someone whose body was making a decision his mind hadn't finished making yet. Mercer stepped into the doorway behind Olivia. 2 of her officers materialized from the hallway. She'd called them up while Olivia was walking, a fact Olivia registered and filed. They didn't enter the office. They didn't need to. They stood in the doorway, and the geometry of the situation changed. Hale put the papers down, not quickly, slowly, with the elaborate deliberateness of someone making sure the act of compliance couldn't be read as admission. But he put them down. Voss's hand came away from the envelope. The printer stopped running. In the sudden quiet, Olivia could hear her own heartbeat, which was faster than she would have preferred, though she was managing it. The next 40 minutes happened in layers, the way institutional collapses always did. Not one dramatic event, but a sequence of smaller ones, each removing a support until the structure's own weight became the problem. Malloy's team arrived in person before the hour was up. 2 federal investigators in plain clothes with credentials and an evidence kit. The kind of unhurried professionalism that only came with people who had done this many times and knew the difference between urgency and panic. They took possession of the documents in Voss's office. They imaged both administrative terminals. They requested and received the medication administration logs that Priya had already provided to Mercer's officers, and they cross-referenced them against the billing records that had first flagged Rourke's unit 9 weeks ago. Olivia wasn't in the room for most of this. She was down the hall in a consultation space with Mercer and one of the investigators, giving a statement, not testimony, not yet, but a structured account of what she'd observed over 14 months that was being recorded and documented with the same careful methodology that everything else was being documented. She told it straight. No editorializing, no emphasis she couldn't support. The incident 14 months ago that had landed in her personnel file as resolved, she'd flagged an inconsistency in a controlled substance count during a shift handover. The numbers in the electronic record hadn't matched the physical inventory in the Pyxis cabinet. She'd reported it to the charge nurse. 2 days later, she'd been told it was a data entry error, corrected. She'd accepted that. She hadn't had a reason not to. The investigator, a woman named Solis with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a pen she kept clicking open and shut, made notes without looking up. And after that point, Solis said, "Did you observe any additional irregularities?" 3 more instances over the following 8 months where the count felt off. Twice I reported it informally, mentioned it to whoever was handling the shift. Once I documented it in the patient care log because it was directly relevant to a patient's pain management. That note was later marked as entered in error and removed from the active record. She paused. I only know it was removed because I checked the chart again 2 weeks later for a different reason. Solis looked up. Do you know who removed it? No, I saw the flag on the entry. I didn't investigate it at the time. Why not? Olivia thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I assumed I'd made an error somewhere. The documentation said I had. And the people responsible for telling me whether I'd made an error were the people responsible for the documentation. She paused. I was wrong to assume that. Solis nodded, wrote something. Anything else you want to add before we go on? Priya Anand, Olivia said. The charge nurse. She kept her own records. 4 months of notes, handwritten. I'd like you to make sure that's part of whatever happens next. She did that without knowing she was doing anything significant. She's already been interviewed, Solis said. Her notes are very thorough. That tracked. Priya was thorough about everything. Work was out of surgery at 4:47. Olivia was told by one of Mercer's officers, who appeared in the doorway of the consultation room with the flat factual economy of someone delivering information and nothing more. Surgery complete, patient in recovery, prognosis stable, surgeon requesting a consult on post-operative protocol given the atypical injury pattern. She excused herself from the statement. Solis waved her off with the gesture of someone who'd gotten what she needed for now, and went upstairs. The recovery room on the surgical floor had 4 bays separated by curtain partitions and a nursing station in the center that faced all of them. Rourke was in Bay 2, which was the bay nearest the window. He was intubated, still sedated, with 2 drip lines and a cardiac monitor running its slow green line across the screen. The surgeon, a woman named Dr. Pack, compact and direct, who Olivia had worked alongside twice in the past 3 years, was at the foot of the bed reviewing the operative notes. Bennett, Pack said without looking up, I heard today was complicated. That's one word. The splenic repair was clean. The thoracic damage was older than we initially read. Probably happened 48 hours before the acute event. He was running on a held breath for 2 days. She looked up. You caught it fast. The pressure trend was clear. It wasn't clear to anyone else in that room. Peck said it neutrally, as observation, not as accusation of the others or credit to Olivia. Just fact. He's going to need a monitored recovery. The blast exposure has some secondary indicators I want to watch. Liver enzymes are elevated. Could be contusion. Could be something we missed. I'd feel better with a second pair of eyes. I'm not credentialed here right now, Olivia said. Mercer's office called my attending line 40 minutes ago and told me you were operating under a federal consultation authority and to treat your clinical judgment accordingly. Pack put the chart down. So, what do you think? She looked at the monitor. Liver enzymes, blast contusion, secondary indicators. The picture was consistent with a high-pressure shockwave event, the body's internal organs sustaining damage from the pressure differential rather than direct impact. It was the kind of injury that looked stable and wasn't. She'd seen it in a different context entirely, in conditions that were not this room, and she knew exactly what the next 12 hours needed to look like. Continuous monitoring on the enzymes. Serial abdominal exams every 4 hours. If he spikes a fever before he's extubated, assume infectious until proven otherwise. Blast injuries seed bacteria in ways that don't always show up where you expect. She looked at Pack. And when he wakes up, I'd like to be there. Pack nodded. I'll let recovery know. She stood at the foot of Rourke's bed for a moment after Pack left. He looked older than she remembered, though that was probably just the particular vulnerability of an unconscious person. The absence of expression flattened everything. He had a scar on his chin that hadn't been there before, new lines around his eyes, the face of someone who had continued to have a difficult life after the last time she'd seen him. She'd continued to have a difficult life too, in her own quieter way. She supposed that was something they had in common. She went back downstairs. Mat. The thing about institutional collapse was that it moved through a building the way a weather system moved. You could feel it before you could see it, in the way people stood and spoke and avoided certain hallways. By 5:30, Pine Valley Medical Center had a particular atmospheric quality that Olivia recognized as the specific anxiety of an institution that had realized something was happening and didn't yet know the shape of it. The ER staff knew something. The word had moved through the department in the imprecise, accurate way that hospital gossip always moved, partial information filled in by inference, more right than wrong in its general outline. Federal investigators. Military. Olivia Bennett, who had been walked out this morning, now apparently credentialed back in under circumstances nobody could clearly explain. She heard two nurses talking in the hallway near the supply station. Voices dropped, but not dropped enough. One of them she knew well. A man named Garrett, who'd been on the night shift for 5 years and had the particular combination of warmth and cynicism that developed in people who worked nights in emergency care. Hale's been up on admin for 2 hours, Garrett was saying. Is he being, interviewed? Somebody's interviewing somebody? You see the guys with the cases? I saw them going into the records room. Yeah. A pause. I heard Bennett was the one who caught the splenic. On Rourke? She diagnosed that? Pulled it right out of a deteriorating pressure trend. Garfield confirmed it. A silence with a specific texture to it. The kind that meant someone was revising an opinion they'd held without examining it closely. She's been saying things were wrong for months, the second nurse said. I thought she was just... Yeah, Garrett said. I know. Olivia moved past them without stopping. She wasn't interested in the revision in real time. She had other things to manage. The Veritas medical supply thread was the one she kept returning to. Not the fabricated incident reports. Those were damage to her, personal and infuriating, but they were also evidence, and evidence was now in the hands of people with federal authority, and she trusted that process to move. The Veritas connection was the part that had implications beyond Pine Valley, beyond Hale and Voss, beyond what she could currently see. She found Malloy in the consultation room on the second floor where the investigators had set up. He looked like she'd imagined from his voice, mid-40s, careful eyes, the build of someone who sat at desks but had once done something more physical and kept enough of the habit to remain alert. He was looking at a laptop when she knocked on the open door. Ms. Bennett. I have a question, she said. You can sit down. She sat. Veritas Medical Supply. You asked me about Hale's relationship with them. What I know is nothing. I'd never heard the name, but if I'd caught a count irregularity 14 months ago and it was related to Veritas, what would the mechanism look like? Malloy looked at her for a moment. He was deciding something, how much to give, what the exchange was worth. He clicked open his pen. Veritas is a regional distributor. They supply controlled substances, surgical materials, specialty medications to 6 hospitals in this area. Their contract with Pine Valley has been running for 3 years. He paused. About 16 months ago, Veritas flagged an internal discrepancy to their own compliance team, a volume discrepancy. They were shipping quantities to Pine Valley that didn't match what Pine Valley was billing back through insurance. Pine Valley was billing for more than they received, billing for exactly what they received, receiving less than the shipment manifest indicated. He let that sit. Someone was intercepting part of the shipment before it reached hospital inventory, or diverting from inventory after receipt and adjusting the manifest to cover it, and billing as if the full quantity was administered. Yes, she thought about it. The physical inventory not matching the electronic record, the Pyxis cabinet count that was off, the entry in the patient chart that was later flagged as an error and removed. Patients whose records said they'd received a controlled medication that, in some cases, they may not have received, or may have received something substituted in its place. Patients were affected, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so, in a subset of cases. Not all. The diversion appears targeted, specific timing, specific medication types. We're still mapping it. He paused. It was sophisticated enough that it ran 16 months before we were able to get a case built. The Veritas internal flag was what gave us the entry point. Without that, we might still be looking at a billing discrepancy with no clear culprit. And Rourke's unit found the military contract angle. His unit identified that someone with a DoD contractor account was using it to route payments through Veritas for what appeared to be legitimate procurement. The contractor account was a shell, registered, credentialed, but inactive except for these transactions. He looked at her. Whoever was running this had connections outside the hospital. The inside operation needed outside infrastructure. That's what made it durable. Olivia sat with that. The picture was assembling itself in a way that felt both clarifying and worse with each piece that locked in. A diversion scheme that had run for over a year. Patients given substandard pain management, or nothing, or something that wasn't what their chart said. Medical staff manipulated through falsified documentation. And when someone started noticing, when she had started noticing, a systematic effort to remove her before she understood what she'd found. Hale, she said. He's the primary target of the investigation, yes. And Voss? She's a person of interest. Her level of knowledge versus participation is something we're still determining. He paused. There are others. It's not a two-person operation. She nodded. She stood up. She needed to move. The room was too static for the size of what she was sitting with. One more thing, Malloy said. She stopped at the door. The false incident reports in your file. The fabricated documentation. He held her gaze. The access logs show the entries being made from Hale's terminal in 7 instances and from an administrative account in 4. But there's a 5th account, read-only access, that has been pulling your file repeatedly over the past 8 months. 31 pulls. He paused. We don't know whose credentials that is yet. The account is registered to a former employee who left the hospital 14 months ago. 14 months. Again, that number. The same time I flagged the count discrepancy, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of someone who had delivered information accurately and was waiting to see what happened to it. Was the former employee's departure voluntary, Mal? She said. A pause. That's still being determined. She left the room. The hallway was ordinary. Ceiling tiles, cart ruts on the linoleum, the intercom paging someone to the 3rd floor. She walked it at normal speed. She went down 1 flight of stairs, pushed through the door to the patient floor, and stopped in the stairwell for a moment with her hand on the rail. 31 pulls on her file. Someone had been reading her personnel record repeatedly for 8 months, watching the fabricated documentation accumulate, monitoring the case being built against her. Not building it, watching it. Why watch it? If you were involved, you'd build and move on. You wouldn't keep checking. Unless you were watching because you were worried, because you knew what was happening and you couldn't stop it and the only thing you could do was monitor. Or unless you were looking for something specific, something you needed to find before someone else did. She let go of the railing, pushed through the stairwell door and back into the patient corridor. Priya Anand was at the nurse's station at the end of the hall. She looked up when Olivia came through the door. 4 months of handwritten notes in a personal notebook. 4 months of tracking anomalies in controlled substance logs, on her own time, saying nothing, Because she didn't know what she was looking at, or because she was afraid of what would happen if she said something to the wrong person. Olivia walked toward her. Priya's face did something complicated, relief and anxiety arriving at the same time, which was an uncomfortable combination to hold. "I need to ask you something," Olivia said, low. Priya nodded. "The controlled substance anomalies you tracked. How did you decide to start tracking?" Priya's hands were still on her keyboard. She didn't move them. "About 4 months ago, I noticed a count that was off on a fentanyl order. I assumed I'd miscounted. I recounted. Still off. I reported it to the shift supervisor. And she said it was fine, that the count reconciled on the system." Priya's voice was careful. "But I'd done the physical count myself, and the physical count and the system weren't the same." She paused. "So I started writing it down, because I thought maybe I was going crazy." "You weren't." "I know that now." "Priya," Olivia looked at her directly. "Before 4 months ago, was there anything else? Anything that made you look twice?" Something moved across Priya's face. Not new information, the recognition of information she'd been carrying and not known what to do with. "There was a nurse," she said. "Before your time here, or almost before. She left about a month after you started. Her name was Torres. Renata Torres." A pause. "She asked me something once, in the break room. She asked if I ever noticed the count being off on the overnight orders." Priya's voice was quieter now. "I said I hadn't. She said she had. And then 2 weeks later she put in her notice and left." Another pause. "I always thought it was just, what did HR record as her reason for leaving?" "I don't know. I assumed she'd found something better, or that she didn't like it here." Priya looked at her. "Is she?" "I don't know," Olivia said. "But I need you to tell the investigators exactly what you just told me. Exactly. Don't summarize it. Tell them the detail. The name." Priya nodded. "Okay." Olivia straightened. She looked down the hall toward the recovery floor elevator, where Rourke was upstairs, sedated, in a body that had almost not made it to this building. Renata Torres, a former employee who had left 14 months ago. A read-only account accessing Olivia's file 31 times over 8 months, using credentials registered to someone who no longer worked here. Not building the case against Olivia. Not participating in the scheme. Watching it, tracking it from the outside. Because Torres had found something and left before it could happen to her. And she'd been watching for 14 months from somewhere outside this building, waiting for someone inside it to catch up. She pulled out her phone. She didn't have a number for Malloy yet. She'd have to go back upstairs. She turned toward the elevator. Her phone rang in her hand, not a federal relay number this time. A cell number with a Portland area code, no contact name attached. The call connected before she made the deliberate choice to answer it. Muscle memory, the same reflex that had picked up Mercer's call at the gas station 3 hours and a lifetime ago. Silence on the line. Then breathing. Then a voice, female, low, with the specific flatness of someone who had practiced being unremarkable and had maybe practiced it too long. "I know you're at Pine Valley," the voice said. "I've been watching the building's network traffic. They pulled in federal. That means it's moving." A pause. "My name is Renata Torres. I need you to listen very carefully because I've only got about 4 minutes before this number gets flagged." Olivia stood absolutely still in the middle of the patient corridor. "Hale isn't the top of it," Torres said. "He's the mechanism. There's someone above him, someone who doesn't appear in any of the hospital records, who never set foot in that building in any documented capacity, and who has been running this operation from outside the institution for 3 years. Her voice was steady and quiet and carried the weight of someone who had been alone with this for too long. "I found a name 14 months ago. It's why I left. It's why I've been monitoring from outside. Because if I'd stayed and said it out loud inside that building, I would have been the one who disappeared." A pause. "The name is in a file I've had encrypted and stored off-site since the day I walked out. I'm sending you the access key right now. You'll have 30 seconds to open it before it self-locks. After that, the only copy is with a lawyer in Seattle who has instructions to release it to the FBI if I don't check in by 8 a.m. tomorrow." Olivia's phone buzzed. A text, a string of alphanumeric characters. 4 minutes, Torres said. "Open it." And somewhere above her, on the administrative floor, she heard the specific sound of a door opening fast. Not the measured movement of an investigator, not the controlled pace of hospital staff. The sound of someone moving quickly who had just realized they were running out of time. She typed the access key with her thumb while already moving toward the stairwell. The phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. Torres still on the line, breathing with the controlled steadiness of someone who had rehearsed staying calm for a long time. The file opened. A document, encrypted PDF, now decrypted on her screen. 2 pages, dense, formatted like a financial disclosure with names and account numbers and dates running in columns she couldn't fully process while walking. She scanned the top of the first page and stopped moving. The name at the top was not Marcus Hale. It was a name she recognized from a different context entirely, from the hospital's published board of trustees, from the framed headshot in the main lobby near the reception desk, from the letterhead on the formal communication she'd received this morning informing her that her employment had been terminated. Raymond Croft, Pine Valley Medical Center's chairman of the board. "Torres," she said, "you see it. How long have you had this?" 14 months. I built it over 6 weeks before I left. Croft is the external infrastructure. He has a private equity position in Veritas Medical Supply through a holding company. The holding company doesn't appear in his public disclosures because it's registered under his wife's maiden name in Delaware. Torres's voice didn't waver. Hale manages the inside operation, Croft manages the money. They've been doing this at 2 other facilities, one in Washington State, one in Idaho. Pine Valley was the most profitable because the ER volume is high and the oversight is thin. Above her, through the ceiling, through a floor of concrete and tile and whatever was happening up there, the sound of footsteps moving in a direction that felt deliberate. "Someone knows the file is open," Olivia said. "Possibly. The access I built was clean, but if they've been monitoring network traffic, someone just started moving fast upstairs." A pause. "Then you need to get that file off your phone and onto something the investigators can take physical custody of right now. Screenshot it, forward it, whatever. But get it off a device that can be remotely wiped." Olivia was already in the stairwell. She took the steps up 2 at a time, phone in one hand, and pushed through the door to the administrative floor with her shoulder. The hallway was not the same hallway it had been 20 minutes ago. There were more people in it, investigators, 2 of Mercer's officers, and at the far end, near the administrative wing, a cluster of movement that resolved as she got closer into Malloy and 2 of his people converging on a point near Voss's office. And just outside that point, being talked to by a man she didn't recognize in a gray suit, was Raymond Croft. He'd arrived while she was downstairs. She didn't know when. She hadn't seen him come in, hadn't been told he was in the building. He was 63, trim in the way of men who had expensive habits and personal trainers, with the practiced affect of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered. He was talking to the man in the gray suit with the confident fluency of someone managing a situation, not responding to one. His lawyer, she realized. He'd arrived with his lawyer. She forwarded the Torres file to Malloy's number. She'd gotten it from the business card he'd left on the consultation room table, and then she walked directly toward the cluster of people at the end of the hall. Malloy saw her coming. He clocked the phone in her hand, and something in his expression shifted. The particular attention of an investigator, recognizing that something has changed. She held up the phone. He crossed toward her, meeting her halfway. "Torres?" she said, low. "Renata Torres. She's on the line right now. She's been monitoring from outside the hospital for 14 months. She has a file." She showed him the screen. "I just forwarded it to you. The name at the top isn't Hale." Malloy looked at the forwarded document on his own phone. He looked at the name. His face did something small and controlled. "When did you get this?" 3 minutes ago." He looked down the hall at Croft, back at her. "Is Torres still on the line?" She handed him the phone. He walked with it toward the window at the end of the hallway, speaking low and fast, and she watched him do it. Watched the shape of his posture change slightly as Torres told him what she'd told Olivia. Watched the moment when the investigation she'd been building arrived at a point that was different from where it had started. She turned and looked at Croft. He was still talking to his lawyer, still managing, but he'd noticed her. His eyes had moved to her the way eyes move to something that didn't fit the expected frame, and the movement had a quality of recognition she hadn't anticipated. He knew who she was, not just as the nurse who'd been fired, as something specific. She held his gaze across the hallway. He looked away first. The next hour was procedural in a way that felt oddly quiet given everything that preceded it. Malloy's team expanded. 2 more investigators arrived from a federal satellite office in Salem, and they moved through the administrative floor with the systematic patience of people who had a list and were working through it. Croft's lawyer issued 3 objections in the first 20 minutes, all of them technically precise and none of them successful, because the preservation order and the accompanying federal warrant that Malloy had apparently had ready and waiting covered everything the lawyer tried to protect. Croft himself stopped talking. That was the tell. Olivia had watched enough people in institutional crisis situations to know that the ones who were truly exposed went quiet at a specific point, not because they'd been advised to by counsel, though they had, but because talking required the fiction of control, and control had become untenable. He sat in a chair that had been placed, not unkindly, against the wall near the administrative assistant's desk. His lawyer stood beside him. He looked at the floor. Hale did not go quietly. She heard it before she saw it, his voice from inside Voss's office, raised in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not the authority voice he deployed in the trauma bay or the cold professional certainty of the break room confrontation. Something rawer. She stood in the hallway and listened. Not what this looks like. The Veritas arrangement was standard procurement practice. There's nothing in my contract that prohibits... Solis's voice flat. Dr. Hale, I need you to stop speaking. I am not going to stop speaking. I have the right to explain the context of... You have the right to an attorney. I've told you that twice. If you'd like to continue without one, that is your choice. But I want to be clear that everything you're saying is being recorded. A silence. Then quieter. I want to call someone. Of course. Olivia moved away from the door. She didn't need to hear the rest of that. Voss was in a separate room. Malloy had separated them within the first 15 minutes, standard practice, and Olivia didn't know what was being said in that room and found she didn't particularly need to. What she knew was that Voss's level of participation versus knowledge was, as Malloy had said, still being determined. She'd watched Voss's face in the moment the folder had landed on the table. There was guilt in it, but the shape of guilt was complicated. It could mean she'd built the scheme alongside Hale, or it could mean she'd known about it and done nothing, or it could mean she'd been told enough to understand what was happening and had made the calculation that the institution's stability required her silence. Any of those was a failure. The degrees mattered legally. She went back downstairs. The ER was running its ordinary evening operations. The waiting room was 2/3 full. The trauma bay had a car accident patient and a child with a possible fracture. The nursing station was doing what nursing stations did. She stood at the edge of it for a moment and felt the strangeness of that. The persistence of ordinary institutional life directly beneath the floor where an investigation was dismantling the institution's leadership. Garrett was at the station. He saw her and didn't look away, which was itself a statement. "Rourke's awake," he said. "Recovery called down 10 minutes ago. He's asking for you." The recovery bay was dim, the way recovery rooms were in the early evening. The overhead lights turned down, the monitoring equipment providing its own faint illumination. The sounds of the building reduced to the specific acoustic texture of a floor where people were supposed to be resting. Rourke was in Bay 2, no longer intubated, lying with his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling with the unfocused attention of someone whose brain was working its way back from sedation. He heard her come in. His eyes moved to the door. "Bennett," he said. His voice was rough, lower than she remembered, and the effort of even that one word was visible in the tension around his jaw. "Don't try to be coherent right now," she said. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. "I'll do the talking." A faint exhale that might have been a sound of agreement. "Croft is upstairs," she said. "Malloy has the Torres file. The investigation is moving." She watched his face. "You knew about Torres." A slight nod. "The monitors didn't change. She's been outside for 14 months. She's been watching." She looked at him. Did you know where she was? The effort of speaking was clearly significant, and he made it anyway. Safe house, Seattle. A pause to breathe. We put her there. After she contacted my unit. Another pause. She had the name. We couldn't move without corroboration. The Veritas supply records. Yes. So you've been running this for 14 months and it took a forward operating injury to bring you to my hospital. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. The timing was... He stopped, breathed. Not planned. No, she said. I assumed not. She looked at the monitor for a moment. His pressure was better, still low for comfort, but on the right side of concerning. Why me? When Mercer called, she said you'd told her 6 weeks ago. If anything happened, find me. He looked at the ceiling again. A long pause. Not evasion, she thought, but the effort of assembling language through sedation and pain into something accurate. You see things, he said finally. You've always seen things. When you caught the count irregularity 14 months ago, we knew about that. Torres told us. And we knew they'd identified you as a threat and started building the file. He stopped, breathed 3 times. We couldn't tell you. The investigation needed the scheme to keep running long enough to trace the full infrastructure. If we'd warned you, I would have done something, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The specific discomfort of understanding that she'd been a known variable in someone else's calculation, that her progressive isolation, the fabricated documentation, the firing this morning, had all proceeded while people with the authority to stop it had let it proceed because the investigation required it. You could have told me, she said. Yes. His voice was quiet. I know. That's not an apology. No, it's an acknowledgement. Another pause. I'm sorry, Olivia, for the way it went. She hadn't heard her first name from anyone today. It landed differently than she expected. She looked at the chair arm, at her own hand resting on it, and didn't say anything for a moment. The patients who were diverted, she said. How many cases are we talking about? Solis's team will have a number by tomorrow. Our estimate was between 40 and 60 instances over 14 months. Some received substandard substitutes. Some received nothing effective. He paused. We don't have the full clinical picture yet. 40 to 60 patients. People who came into this building in pain or in crisis and received something from a nurse or a doctor who believed, because the system told them to believe, that they were giving the right medication. People whose charts now contained a record of care that didn't match what had actually happened to them. Are any of them... She stopped. 3 adverse outcomes that may be attributable. We're still building causation. His voice was careful on that, with the weight of someone who understood what causation meant in a legal and human sense. The investigation will address those specifically. She nodded, said nothing. The monitor ran its green line. Outside the bay window, the sky was full dark now, and the parking lot lights had come on, casting their flat orange light over the rows of cars. Somewhere in the building above them, a man who had run this scheme for 3 years was sitting in a chair and looking at the floor. There's something else, Rourke said. She looked at him. Croft's lawyer, the man who arrived with him. He stopped to breathe. The effort was getting more visible, the sedation wearing thinner and the pain moving in behind it. His name is Weston Farr. He's a medical liability attorney based in Portland, 40-year practice. He's handled Pine Valley's malpractice defense for 11 years. Another pause. He's also listed as a director of the Delaware Holding Company, the one that holds Croft's position in Veritas. She went still. Farr isn't just Croft's lawyer, Rourke said. He's a participant. His firm has been managing the legal architecture of the scheme since the beginning. The holding company structure, the contractor account, the documentation. He held her gaze. He came here tonight because Croft called him when the federal activity started. He didn't come to defend Croft. He came to manage what Croft said. A very slight pause. And to make sure certain things didn't come out of certain rooms. Does Malloy know? Tell him. She was already standing. She put her hand briefly on the bed rail. Not on Rourke, just on the rail, the way you might place your hand on a table to orient yourself in a room. Then she walked out of the bay and pulled out her phone. Malloy's reaction to the information about Farr was contained in the way that competent people contain things. A brief, deliberate pause, a question to clarify that she was sure of the source, and then movement. He excused himself from the room where he'd been working and went directly to find Solis, and Olivia watched the two of them have a 30-second conversation in the hallway that resulted in Solis picking up her phone and Malloy walking toward the administrative wing with the specific speed of someone adjusting a plan that was already in motion. She followed at a distance. She wanted to see it, not for satisfaction exactly, though she wouldn't pretend satisfaction wasn't somewhere in the picture. More because she'd been moved through this building all day as a variable, a target, an inconvenience, a resource, and she was done being managed. She wanted to see the room. Farr was in the administrative wing conference room, a different room from where Croft was sitting, which had been either Farr's choice or Croft's. She passed the open doorway of Croft's room and glanced in. He was still in the chair, still looking at the floor, his bearing subtly different than it had been an hour ago. The lawyer posture, the managed composure, had settled into something flatter. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and was beginning to understand it hadn't been the right one. Farr was different. He was standing when Malloy came in, standing with his jacket still buttoned and his briefcase on the table, projecting the contained energy of someone who had been managing complex situations for 4 decades and was not remotely alarmed. He was in his early 70s, lean, with the very white hair of someone who had let it go naturally, and the very steady eyes of someone who had won a lot of rooms. Olivia stayed in the doorway. "Mr. Farr," Malloy said, putting his credentials on the table, "I need to speak with you about your relationship with a Delaware-registered company called Ridgeline Holdings and its subsidiary interest in Veritas Medical Supply." Something moved through Farr's expression. Fast, immediately controlled, but present. Olivia caught it. A recalculation. The specific quality of a man realizing that the investigation was not where he'd assumed it was. "I'll need a moment to consult with my own counsel," Farr said. "Of course," Malloy said. "We'll need to hold your briefcase and any devices while you do." A pause. The briefcase was on the table between them. Neither man moved. "That's not," Farr started. "It's covered by the preservation order, which was issued for all parties with documented involvement in the scheme. Your name appears in the Ridgeline Holdings registration." Malloy's voice was entirely even. "We can do this with or without a conversation about it. The documentation is what it is." The briefcase stayed on the table. Farr sat down. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him in this building, like someone who understood the geometry had changed. Olivia stepped back from the doorway. She found Priya at the end of the patient corridor, doing something with a medication cart that she clearly didn't need to be doing at this hour. Olivia recognized it as the occupational fidget of someone who needed to keep her hands moving. "They're talking to everyone," Priya said, without looking up. "There's been 2 interviews on this floor alone. Garrett, the overnight supervisor, one of the pharmacy techs." She paused. "Me again, a longer one. How did it go?" "I told them about Torres, the name, what she said, the conversation in the break room." She looked up. "I also told them that 6 months ago I found a count off on a hydromorphone order, and I reported it, and the supervisor told me it reconciled, and I let it go." She stopped. "I let it go. You didn't have the full picture. 4 months later I started keeping notes because I couldn't stop thinking it was wrong. But for 6 months before that, I let it go." She looked down at the cart. "I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that." Olivia looked at her. There was a version of this conversation that offered reassurance, that told Priya it wasn't her fault, that the people running the scheme were sophisticated, that she couldn't have known. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. "You kept the notes," she said. "When it mattered, you kept the notes. That's what the investigation has. That's what they're working from." A pause. "What you do with the 6 months before that is between you and yourself, but it doesn't cancel the 4 months after." Priya was quiet. Then, "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "I don't know. It's just true." Priya almost laughed. Not quite, but the motion was there. "You're a terrible comfort, you know that?" I know. Thank you, Priya said. For what it's worth. Olivia moved on. She went to the break room and made coffee, the real kind from the machine that took actual grounds, not the dispensed variety, and sat down at the table with a cup and didn't think about anything for approximately 4 minutes, which was the longest she'd managed not to think about anything all day. Then her phone buzzed, a text from a number she now recognized as Mercer's. Croft's being taken for formal interview at the federal building in Portland. Farr is following under separate counsel. Hale has requested a lawyer and stopped talking. Voss is cooperating. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down and finished her coffee. Well, the story that emerged over the following 3 hours was not clean. Institutional collapses rarely were. It came out in pieces through investigator briefings that Malloy shared with her in partial form, through information Mercer's people gathered from the military contract angle, through the Torres file, which had, it turned out, 12 supplementary documents attached that needed processing and cross-referencing with what the OIG team had independently built. Raymond Croft had been moving money through Veritas for 3 years. The mechanism was exactly as Torres had documented: a holding company, a contractor account, a supply chain arrangement that permitted systematic diversion of controlled substances from Pine Valley's inventory. The diverted medications were resold through a secondary distribution network that Veritas's own rogue logistics manager had established, a man named Pruitt, who had already been arrested in a parallel action in Seattle that afternoon. Olivia hadn't known about Pruitt. Rourke's unit had. The clinical damage was still being mapped. Solis's team identified 51 instances of confirmed diversion affecting patient care over 14 months, 3 adverse outcomes with probable causal links to inadequate pain management. One patient, a post-operative cancer case from 7 months ago, who had received a saline substitute instead of the ordered opioid analgesic, and whose pain crisis had been documented in her chart as psychological in origin. That one stayed with Olivia in a specific way. The woman's name was in the records. She'd been in this building, in this department, and someone had watched her be in pain and written it off as anxiety. Hale had signed off on that case. She read the summary in the consultation room at 9:45 at night, sitting across from Solis, who had coffee that was better than the break room variety, and who said, at the end of the briefing, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who didn't offer things she didn't mean, "Your work today, catching the splenic injury, the contact with Torres, the Farr identification, that's in the record. Formally. It'll be part of the investigative report." "Okay," Olivia said. "Okay," Solis agreed and closed her folder. Olivia went back to check on Rourke. He was asleep. Actually asleep, not sedated, which was better. His numbers were where she wanted them. She stood in the bay doorway for a moment and watched the monitor's green line, and thought about 14 months of catching things without knowing what she was catching, and about the 41 patients whose cases were straightforward and the 51st whose chart said she'd been anxious when she'd been in pain, and about Priya's handwritten notebook, and about Renata Torres in a safe house in Seattle watching the building she'd left because staying would have cost her too much. She thought about Marcus Hale, who was somewhere in this building waiting for a lawyer, and about Raymond Croft on his way to a federal building in Portland, and about Weston Farr, who had walked into this hospital with a briefcase and the confidence of a man who had managed 40 years of difficult rooms and had finally found one he couldn't manage. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the particular exhaustion of a long day in which a lot of things that had been wrong for a long time had started moving toward being less wrong, which was a different thing than being right, and which would take considerably longer than one day. She turned to leave the recovery bay. One of Malloy's investigators, the younger one, a man named Ortega, who had been moving through the building all evening with a laptop and a very large thermos of coffee, was in the hallway. He looked like someone who had been waiting for her to come out. "Solis wants you," he said. "Conference room, now." "What happened?" "The Torres file, the supplementary documents." He paused. "One of them is a recorded phone call, 14 months old, Croft and Hale." Another pause. "And a third person." "Who?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who was aware they were delivering something significant and was trying to do it accurately. "We're still confirming identity, but the voice on the call refers to..." We need you to listen to it because there's a section where the person is referenced by description, not by name. He paused. The description matches you. It's from 14 months ago, the week after you flagged the count discrepancy. And what's being discussed? He stopped. What's being discussed? She said. He looked at her steadily. How to handle you, specifically, and what to do if the handle didn't work. He paused one more time. The third voice on that call isn't far. It's not anyone we've identified yet, and the call was made from inside this building, from a landline extension that was assigned 14 months ago to someone who still works here. The hallway felt very still. Someone who still worked here. Someone who had been in this building today, who had watched the investigation move through the floors, had watched Croft arrive with his lawyer, had watched Olivia walk back through the door she'd been walked out of this morning. "Which extension?" she said. Ortega looked at his phone, read her the number. She knew the extension. She'd called it. She'd transferred patients to it. She'd heard it paged overhead on morning rounds 100 times in 3 years. It was the extension for the ER's attending physician lounge, the room that multiple attendings used that had no permanent assignment, that anyone with a staff badge could access. It was also, she knew, because she knew this building, directly adjacent to the room where right now Marcus Hale was waiting for his lawyer. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, and attention right now belonged to the investigators, not to her. She walked at the speed of someone with somewhere to be and a clear reason for being there, which was fast enough. Ortega was behind her on his radio, and she heard him relaying the extension information to Solus in the clipped shorthand of someone who understood the implication without needing it spelled out. The hallway on the ER floor was ordinary, evening staff, the ambient noise of a department in operation, the overhead lights at their standard brightness. Nothing about it looked like what it was, which was a building in the process of coming apart at its load-bearing points. The attending physician lounge was at the end of the east corridor, past the trauma bay, past the supply station, past the room where she'd had the conversation with Hale 2 nights ago that had ended with him telling her this wasn't the right environment for her. The door was solid wood with a narrow vertical window. She slowed as she approached it, not from hesitation but from the professional instinct of someone who had learned to read a room before entering it. Through the window, Hale, seated at the small table, his jacket off, his phone face up in front of him. He was looking at the phone, not using it, looking at it, the way people looked at things when they were thinking about what they'd already done with them. She pushed the door open. He looked up. The calculation in his face was immediate and visible. Who she was, what her presence here meant, what it said about what the investigators had found, and when. She watched him run it and arrive somewhere that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. A kind of reckoning. "There's a recorded phone call," she said. 14 months old. You, Croft, and a third person, made from the landline in this room. He said nothing. The third voice is unidentified, but Malloy's team is working from the extension record, and the call was made from here, and the access log for this room is going to tell them who badged in that day. She stood in the doorway. If there's someone else in this building who's part of this, the time to say that is now. Not because I'm asking you to do the right thing, I've stopped having that conversation with you, but because the recording exists, and the extension record exists, and whatever calculation you're making right now about what's still containable is wrong. Hale looked at his phone on the table. It was Garfield, he said. She hadn't expected it to come that fast. She kept her face still. He was on the call. He's been, he processes the overnight orders. He has system access I don't have. Hale's voice was flat, the way voices got when someone was giving up information as a transaction, calculating what it bought. He didn't set anything up. He just made sure the counts reconciled on the system side. After the fact, the numbers the system showed, after a diversion, were his work. She thought about Garfield in the trauma bay that afternoon, when she'd called for the repeat fast on Rourke. His hesitation, the way he'd looked at the monitor and then at her, and then done what she said. Because the image on the screen was real, and he couldn't argue with it. She'd read that as the resistance of a proud man being corrected. It had been something else also. Did he know what the diversions were for? He knew it was diversion. He didn't know some. I don't think he knew the full scope of Croft's involvement. A pause. He thought it was smaller than it was. That's not a defense. No, Hale said. I know. She stepped back from the door and looked at Ortega, who had been standing 2 feet behind her and had heard every word. He nodded once and got back on his radio. She walked away from the lounge. She didn't look back. Garfield was found in the pharmacy consultation area on the second floor, where he'd apparently been for the past hour doing something administrative that, under the circumstances, had the feeling of a man trying to look occupied while waiting for a door to close on him. He didn't resist. He didn't produce a lawyer or issue objections. He sat down when Solis's team came in, and he answered questions in the voice of someone who had known, for some time, that this particular evening was coming and had used up whatever energy he had on dreading it. Olivia wasn't in the room for that interview. She didn't need to be. She was in the recovery bay checking on Rourke's numbers, which had stabilized cleanly and were now telling a story of a body doing the work it needed to do without drama. He was still asleep. She adjusted the fluid rate by a small amount based on the output numbers, noted it in the temporary clinical record Pack had opened for him, and stood in the bay for a moment doing nothing. The building around her was doing its work. The investigation was doing its work. The machines were doing their work. She had contributed what she had to contribute, and the rest of it was institutional process, which moved at its own pace and according to its own logic and didn't require her to stand in a lounge doorway producing ultimatums. She sat down in the chair beside Rourke's bed and, for the first time since approximately 9 a.m., did not move for 15 minutes. It was Mercer who came and found her there. She came in quietly, which Olivia had noticed was Mercer's default mode when the tactical situation wasn't requiring otherwise, a woman who'd learned to calibrate the volume of her presence to what the room actually needed. She looked at Rourke's monitor, then at Olivia. "Garfield's been detained," she said. "Formal arrest is processing now for Croft and Farr. Hale will be charged. The cooperation may affect the specifics, but not the fact of it." She paused. "Voss's situation is being evaluated. She knew about the documentation being falsified against you. She may not have known the clinical scope." "She knew enough," Olivia said. "Yes, she knew enough." Mercer sat down in the second chair, which she pulled from against the wall. The action was unkernel-like enough that it registered. "There'll be a full board review at Pine Valley starting next week. The board itself is compromised by Croft's position, so an external governance body is being brought in to manage operations during the review period." A pause. "The hospital is going to need clinical leadership that isn't currently under investigation or employed by someone who is." Olivia looked at her. "I'm not making an offer," Mercer said. "That's not my lane. I'm describing a factual situation." A pause that had a particular quality to it. "Other people will be making offers. I wanted you to hear the landscape first from someone who isn't going to frame it in whatever way is convenient for them. I appreciate that. The Torres file is going to be central to everything that follows. She took significant personal risk for 14 months. The OIG is going to want her testimony, her situation, the circumstances of her departure, what was done to make her feel she had to leave. That's going to be part of the formal record. Is she protected? She's been cooperating with a federal investigation, yes." Mercer paused. "She asked about you, when Malloy had her on the phone." Olivia looked at the monitor. "What did she ask?" "Whether you were all right." A pause. "I told her you were functional." Something small moved through Olivia's chest. Not sentiment exactly, more like the recognition of a specific kind of solidarity. A woman she'd never met, in a safe house in Seattle, who had left a building because staying was too dangerous and had spent 14 months watching it anyway, waiting for someone inside to catch up. "Tell her yes," Olivia said. "When you talk to her again, tell her yes." Mercer nodded. They sat in the recovery bay for a while without talking. The monitor ran. Outside the window, the city of Ashford was doing its ordinary Wednesday night things. Traffic, lit windows, the distant sound of someone's car on the highway overpass. Rourke breathed steadily under the thin hospital blanket. The IV dripped at the rate she'd set. 1. She left the hospital at 11:27. Not because she was finished, there was no clean finish line, not tonight, but because Solis had told her formally that her presence wasn't required for the next phase of the process, that her statement was complete, that if anything needed clarification, someone would call. The clinical picture for Rourke was stable, and Pack's team had it. There was nothing left that required her specifically to be in this building tonight, and standing in it for no purpose was a kind of self-punishment she'd decided she wasn't interested in. The parking lot was cold. October in the Cascades had a specific quality after dark, the air coming off the mountain with enough altitude in it to make even a clear night feel close to frost. She stood beside her car for a moment and looked up at the building. 4 stories of lit and unlit windows, the medical lettering visible over the entrance, the ambulance bay lit bright on the east side. A building that had been, for 3 years, the primary architecture of her daily life. That had seemed, this morning, to be something she was being permanently separated from. She got in the car. She drove home. She made toast because it was nearly midnight and soup felt like too much. And she stood at the kitchen counter eating it and looking at nothing in particular on the far wall and thinking about what the woman in the cancer cases chart had experienced, the pain that got written off as psychological, the institutional machinery that processed her complaint as a documentation issue and moved on. That woman's name was Dolores Varga, and she had been 58 years old at the time, and she was alive and had apparently recovered from her surgery, and she didn't know yet that what had happened to her had a different name than the one the chart had given it. She would know soon. The investigators would make sure of that. And knowing would be its own complicated thing. The relief of being right, the retroactive anger, the question of what you did with the understanding that an institution had failed you and called the failure your own pathology. Olivia didn't have a clean answer to that question. She just knew that knowing was better than not knowing, even when knowing was hard. She washed the plate. She went to bed. She slept, which surprised her slightly, for 6 hours without interruption. Check down. The days that followed moved in the way of institutional process, not slowly exactly, but with the weighted deliberateness of something large changing direction. The external governance body arrived at Pine Valley on Thursday. By Friday, an interim clinical director had been appointed, a woman named Dr. Farah Nasir from the regional health system in Eugene, brought in specifically to stabilize operations during the review. The ER continued functioning because ERs had to continue functioning. The staff showed up because the patients showed up, and that equation didn't pause for institutional crisis. Garfield was formally charged on Thursday afternoon. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, and several counts related to the falsification of controlled substance records. The specific accounting of what he'd manipulated and when and how many times was a document that ran to 31 pages. He'd been doing it for 13 months. He'd told himself, in whatever internal negotiation people ran when they were doing something they knew was wrong, that he was only touching numbers, not people. That the system-side reconciliation was abstract, that someone else's choices were the real harm, and he was just maintaining a ledger. The ledger had 51 entries. Hale's charges were more extensive and took longer to formalize because the clinical side of the scheme was more complex than the financial side. The cooperation he'd offered, the Garfield information, was noted. It did not, as Olivia had told him it wouldn't, function as a defense. It functioned as a factor, in the way that factors functioned in a legal process, present, weighted, insufficient to change the fundamental shape of what he'd done. Croft's case was the most complex. The holding company structure, the Veritas relationship, the contractor account. It was the kind of financial architecture that took time to fully dismantle and would take a federal prosecution significantly longer than a week to build into a complete case. What happened quickly was the emergency removal of his board position, which the governance review body ordered on the first day, and the freezing of the accounts connected to Ridgeline Holdings, which the OIG had been waiting for the arrest to do. Farr resigned from his firm on Friday. The firm issued a statement that said, essentially, nothing. His personal exposure was significant enough that he'd hired criminal defense counsel the same night Malloy had requested his devices, which was the action of someone who understood the geometry clearly and was no longer pretending otherwise. Voss's situation resolved in a way that was both less and more than it might have been. The investigation determined that she had known about the falsified documentation against Olivia, had known it was fabricated, had known it was being used to build a termination case, and had participated in that process by signing off on the investigation that she knew was theater. She hadn't known the full clinical scope of the diversion scheme. She hadn't known about Croft's financial architecture. She had made the specific calculation that her institution's stability required her silence on what she did know, and she had been wrong about what that silence would cost. She resigned on Friday afternoon and faced a formal professional disciplinary review through the Oregon Health Authority, the outcome of which would take months to determine and would likely include a significant period of suspension from administrative practice. It wasn't criminal. It was also not nothing. Olivia learned most of this through Solis, who called her on Thursday and Friday with the methodical efficiency of someone closing loops. On Saturday, she received a formal letter from the external governance body, physical mail, which felt appropriate, notifying her that her termination had been reviewed and found to be without legitimate cause and in violation of protected reporting statutes. She was being offered immediate reinstatement with full back pay for the period of termination and a formal written apology from the institution. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table with coffee. Then she folded it and set it down and thought about whether she wanted to go back. The answer to that took 3 days to arrive, and it arrived not as a decision, but as a clarity that accumulated quietly from several directions. Rourke was moved from recovery to a regular room on Saturday. She visited him Sunday afternoon when he was sitting up and had managed to eat something and had a color in his face that looked like a person rather than a patient. He'd shaved, which was impressive given the effort it must have taken, and he had the slightly sheepish quality of someone who had been horizontal for 4 days and was negotiating the return of his own dignity. "You look better," she said. "Low bar." "Yes." She sat down. "How's the pain?" "Managed. Pack's team is careful." He paused. "The good kind of careful." She looked at his chart on the tablet mounted to the wall, numbers that were telling a story of slow, real recovery. Another week inpatient, probably. Then a transfer to the military medical facility in Tacoma for the rehabilitation phase. The liver enzymes have been trending down, which is what we wanted. "You've been checking." "I check things. It's what I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard about Garfield." "Yes?" "I didn't see that one coming." "Neither did I. Until I did." She paused. 14 months, and I was 3 feet from him most days. He watched me flag the count irregularities. He was probably the one who made sure they reconciled on the system before anyone else could see them. She held Rourke's gaze. "I keep thinking about that. What it looks like when someone is complicit in something and still shows up to work every day and functions and does the job." "It looks like everyone else," Rourke said. "That's what I keep arriving at." He nodded. "Torres is coming to Portland next week. The OIG has a preliminary interview scheduled." A pause. "She said she wanted to meet you." "I want to meet her." "I'll tell her." She stood up to go. She was almost at the door when he said, without particular weight, "The letter from the governance body. Nasir told me she was going to be in touch with you separately." She turned. "About?" "The clinical director position has an interim tag on it for now, but the review process is going to take 6 months minimum, and whoever's running clinical operations during that period is going to shape what Pine Valley looks like on the other side of it." He held her gaze. "Nasir is external, and she doesn't know this building. She's going to need someone who does." "I'm a nurse," Olivia said. "You're a nurse who diagnosed the injury that saved my life, identified a federal fraud scheme, and kept a building from destroying its own evidence on the worst day of her professional life." He paused. "The title is a different conversation. The function is the question." She looked at him for a moment. "Get some rest," she said. She walked out of the room. Nasir's call came on Tuesday. It was direct and specific, which Olivia appreciated. No framing, no institutional language to decode. She was calling because the clinical review needed someone with operational knowledge of the department who wasn't under investigation and wasn't compromised by the previous administration's relationships. She was calling because Solis's investigative report had been shared with the governance board as a factual account of the events, and Olivia's role in those events was documented plainly. She was calling because the ER needed a lead clinical voice during the review period, and there was a case to be made for that voice being someone the department already knew. It wasn't director of nursing. It wasn't chief of anything. It was a working role, senior clinical coordinator, interim, with a formal title to be determined after the review. It meant staying in the ER. It meant being accountable for the department's functioning during a period when functioning was going to be harder than usual. It meant working alongside an external interim director in a building that had just had several of its foundations removed. It was not a clean offer. It was a complicated one, carrying the weight of everything the building had done and everything it still needed to do. "I need a few days," she said. "Take them," Nasir said. "And for what it's worth, I read the report fully. What happened to you here was a specific institutional failure. The decision about whether to come back is yours, and it should be made on your terms, not because the institution needs you, though it does." Olivia appreciated the honesty enough to say so. She ended the call and sat on her couch in the afternoon light, and didn't immediately think about the answer. She thought instead about Dolores Varga, who had been in pain in that building and told the pain was in her head. She thought about Priya's handwritten notebook, 4 months of careful documentation that nobody had asked for and that had turned out to matter enormously. She thought about Torres in Seattle, watching a building she'd been forced to leave, waiting for someone inside to catch up. She thought about the count irregularity 14 months ago, the moment she'd noticed something and flagged it and been told she was wrong and had, eventually, half believed it. The specific erosion of being told repeatedly that what you see isn't what's there. How long that took to work on you, and how quietly. She'd spent 3 years at Pine Valley being the person who caught things. Not because she was exceptional. She didn't think of herself that way, and the kind of self-narrative that required a military record to justify basic human dignity was one she'd rejected completely. But because she paid attention, and paying attention was not a gift, it was a practice. It was a thing you chose, repeatedly, at some cost, because the alternative, not looking, not seeing, reconciling yourself to the official version, was a cost too. The institution had failed her. It had failed Dolores Varga. It had failed the other 50 patients in Solis's report, in increments small enough that each one could be explained and large enough, in aggregate, to constitute something that would follow certain people for the rest of their professional lives. And the institution still had patients in it today. Tomorrow. The ER would run tomorrow at 7 a.m. with the same volume and the same pressure and the same gap between what should happen and what was possible. And somebody needed to be in that building who understood what it was supposed to be doing and could hold that standard in the middle of a very difficult period. Not because the institution deserved her. She'd thought about that angle and put it down. Institutions didn't deserve people. People chose where to put their work and for what reasons. She chose the reason that had nothing to do with Pine Valley's board or its administrative history or the formal written apology sitting folded on her kitchen table. She chose it because of Priya's notebook and Dolores Varga's chart and the 49 other entries, and the understanding that somebody seeing something clearly in that building was not a small thing. She called Nasir back on Wednesday morning. The formal hearing was held 3 weeks later, a regulatory proceeding through the Oregon Medical Board and the State Nursing Board, running parallel tracks for the physician and nursing staff involved. It was not a courtroom, though it had the architecture of one. A long table, a panel of reviewers, a record being kept of everything said. Hale was there. She saw him in the hallway before the proceedings began, which she hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for. He looked like himself and also significantly less than himself. The bearing was right, but something underneath it had shifted in a way that didn't quite resolve into his face the way it used to. He looked like a man who had spent 3 weeks understanding what was coming and hadn't found a way to make peace with it. She didn't approach him. He didn't approach her. Inside the hearing room, the investigative record was presented formally for the first time in a consolidated format. The OIG findings, the military investigative record, the Torres documentation, the falsified personnel file with its annotated incident reports, and the clinical record showing the 51 cases of confirmed diversion. Solis presented the summary. One of Rourke's unit officers presented the military side. A lawyer from the HHS Office of General Counsel presented the Veritas and Croft portions. When it was Olivia's turn, she gave her account the same way she'd given it to Solis 3 weeks ago. Direct, sequential, without editorializing. The count irregularity 14 months ago. The chart entry that was removed. the incident reports she'd never been shown, the termination that had been built on documentation she'd never been informed of. She said it all in the flat, accurate voice of someone testifying to a record and not performing an injury. At the end, the panel chair, a woman named Dr. Whitmore, 60-something, with reading glasses and the demeanor of someone who had seen a great many things and had chosen to keep seeing them clearly, asked her one question. Ms. Bennett, in your assessment, what would have happened if you had not been called back to this hospital on the day of your termination? Olivia considered it. The investigation would have proceeded. The federal case was built on evidence that didn't require my presence. She paused. The clinical identification of Commander Rourke's injury might have taken longer. It's possible the delay would have cost him the surgery. Another pause. The third-party voice on the Torres recording might have stayed unidentified longer, though the extension records would have gotten there eventually. She looked at Whitmore. Mostly, I think the answer is that the same things would have happened on a slightly different timeline, with slightly different costs. And what would have happened to you? She hadn't expected that question. She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I would have been angry for a while, she said. And then I would have found another hospital. And I would have kept catching things, because that's what I do, whether anyone was paying attention or not. She paused. The institution's failure wasn't going to change what I am. It was just going to waste it for a while. Whitmore looked at her for a moment. Then she made a note and moved on. The outcomes were delivered over the following weeks in the measured cadence of regulatory and legal proceedings. Hale's medical license was suspended pending the criminal case, with the board's preliminary determination indicating likely permanent revocation upon conviction. Garfield's nursing license was revoked immediately on the strength of the evidence already in the record. Voss received a 5-year suspension from administrative healthcare practice in Oregon. Croft's criminal case would take considerably longer. Federal fraud cases almost always did. But the preliminary charges were filed and the financial holds were in place, and Weston Farr, who had his own parallel exposure, was no longer in a position to manage anyone's legal architecture. The Veritas operation was dismantled entirely. The secondary distribution network that had processed the diverted medications was the subject of a separate investigation in which Pruitt, the Veritas logistics manager in Seattle, was cooperating in exchange for considerations that were none of Olivia's business. Dolores Varga was contacted by the OIG's patient notification team on a Thursday in November. Olivia knew about it because Solis told her, and she thought about it for the rest of that day. The specific moment when a woman in her late 50s, who had been in pain and been told the pain was in her head, received a phone call explaining that she had been right, that the record was wrong, that what happened to her had a name and an accountability attached to it. She hoped Varga had someone with her when she got that call. She hoped the notification team was good at their jobs. She knew that being right and being vindicated didn't erase the experience, and that sometimes justice arrived in a form that reopened things rather than closing them. She sat with that without being able to fix it, which was the thing about consequences. They were real, and they ramified in directions that plans didn't fully anticipate. Torres came to Portland in November. They met in a coffee shop near the OIG field office on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unremarkable as settings went. Small tables, background noise, coffee that was better than hospital coffee, which was the only real standard Olivia had anymore. Torres was 34, compact, with the watchful quality of someone who had been careful for a long time and was learning, slowly, that careful could be a different kind of thing than it had been. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the count irregularities and the notebook and what it felt like to see something and not know what you were seeing, and about the specific exhaustion of being the person who kept noticing. They talked about Garfield, his ordinariness, his functionality, the way he'd come to work and done the job and done the other thing simultaneously. They talked about what the 51 entries in the clinical record meant, and what it took to hold that number and keep working. At the end, Torres said, "I watched that building for 14 months. I was so angry. And then you went back in on the day they fired you, and I thought, that's what it looks like. When someone doesn't let the institution define what they're worth." Olivia looked at her coffee. "I went back in because a man was going to die," she said. That's the honest version. That's also the version that's true about everything else you did, Torres said. You kept doing it because the thing that needed doing was in front of you. That's not small. Olivia didn't have an answer to that. She didn't reach for one. She started the senior clinical coordinator role on a Monday in late November. She drove to the hospital in the dark because her shift started at 6 and the Cascades were already getting the first serious cold of the season. The parking lot had a skim of frost on it. The medical lettering over the entrance was lit the same way it had always been lit. She badged in. The doors opened. The ER smelled like every ER she had ever worked in. That specific combination of antiseptic and recycled air and the particular humanness of a space where people arrived in crisis and were handled by other people who were trying to help them. Priya was at the station doing the shift handover, her notebook. A new one, proper, with the hospital's patient safety documentation system now aligned to accept her kind of tracking, open beside the keyboard. She looked up. Her face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, something direct and warm, without the undertow of anxiety. "Morning," Priya said. "Morning." Olivia set her bag down. "What have we got?" Priya handed her the board. She read it. She asked 3 questions about the overnight cases that needed asking. She moved into the department, and the department moved with her, which was not different from how it had always worked. She had always been someone who could hold a room by knowing what the room needed. The room had never required her to announce herself. What was different was this. She was no longer working around a false record. She was no longer watching numbers reconcile in ways that didn't match what she'd seen. She was no longer the person who caught things in a building that had built a case against the catching. She still wasn't comfortable here in the way comfortable was supposed to feel. The building had a history she was going to be aware of every day, in the rooms that held the memory of what had happened in them, and the charts that were being corrected, and the patients who were being notified. The work of making Pine Valley Medical Center a different institution than it had been was not a thing that resolved cleanly. It was a thing that had to be done, daily, in the specific and unglamorous ways that institutional culture actually changed, through decisions and documentation, and the steady refusal to let something wrong stay the way it was. She knew how to do that. She had been doing it, at some cost and without full credit, for 14 months before anyone else was paying attention. The first patient of her shift came in at 6:14, a 60-year-old man with chest pressure and an EKG that needed reading carefully. She read it carefully. She caught what was there. She made the call that needed making. She didn't think about whether anyone was watching. She didn't think about what it was worth or who would document it, or whether the institution deserved the quality of attention she brought to it. She just worked, because the work was in front of her, because the patient was in front of her, because that had always been the whole of it, not the record, not the title, not the validation of people who should have given it without being compelled. The thing itself. The person in front of you, the problem you could see, the gap between what was happening and what should be happening, and the choice to stand in that gap and do something about it. That was what she was. It had been what she was before anyone knew her name. It would be what she was after. The proceedings were over, and the records were corrected, and the building had finished becoming whatever it was going to become next. The things they had tried to take from her, her reputation, her record, her professional standing, her confidence in what she'd seen with her own eyes, those had been real losses while they lasted. She didn't pretend otherwise. The institution had done damage that the institution's apology did not fully repair, and anyone who told you otherwise had never been the one with the fabricated file. But they hadn't taken what she actually was. They'd tried for 14 months with considerable sophistication, and they hadn't managed it. Not because she was exceptional, because paying attention was a practice, and she had kept the practice, and no document in an administrator's file could alter what a person did when the thing in front of them required doing. Outside the window of Bay 3, where the 60-year-old man with chest pressure was now stable and asking for water, the Cascades were catching the first gray light of a November morning. The frost on the parking lot was starting to lift. The day shift was coming in. The building was doing what buildings like this one did, receiving people, running its systems, trying to be what it was supposed to be, imperfectly, under pressure, with better and worse results depending on who was in it and what they chose. She was in it. She chose.